December 31st, 1994. Russian armored columns roll into Grozny. They move casually. Commanders sit on the armor. Engines idle at traffic lights. It looks like a police patrol. It wasn't. The next 60 hours would erase these columns from existence. Dead, wounded, captured. 60 hours of urban combat, longer than the entire operation was supposed to take, according to the defense minister's plan. He promised a clean sweep with one airborne regiment. He sent thousands into a furnace. This catastrophe didn't happen overnight. Chechnya, a republic of 1 million people, a mix of ethnicities cemented by Soviet power. When the Union collapsed in '91, the cement crumbled. Chechnya declared independence, but they kept more than a flag. They kept the Soviet stockpiles, tanks, artillery, crates of ammunition. Moscow watched a national army form within its own borders. The political paralysis lasted exactly 3 years. By 1 in the afternoon, the armored columns were already deep in the city center. The 131st Maikop Brigade rolled in from the north. They did not move in combat formation. They moved in a convoy, vehicle behind vehicle, 5 meters apart, like a holiday parade on Red Square. At the city limit, the drivers saw a concrete slab. Someone had sprayed a greeting in dripping red paint. "Welcome to hell." The officers ignored it. The conscripts laughed nervously. Inside the BMPs, soldiers pressed their faces against the thick triplex glass. The view made no sense. Street lamps buzzed overhead. Apartment windows glowed with warm yellow light. The city had electricity. Functioning lights in a siege are not a sign of peace. They are a sign of a prepared kill zone. The defenders watched from the rooftops in total silence. They were shocked. They expected a tactical assault. Instead, the Russians were driving into the trap with their hatches open. 2 hours passed. Zero resistance. No shots. No people. Just the roar of diesel engines bouncing off empty buildings. The deeper they went, the safer they felt. At 1300 hours, the lead T-72s ground to a halt on the pavement of the railway station square. Colonel Ivan Savin grabbed the handset. The frequency crackled with static. A voice cut through the interference, addressing him by a nickname only close friends used, Alec. It was Turpal Ali Agariev, a Chechen field commander. Years ago, they wore the same uniform. They served in the same Soviet system, studied the same maps, and memorized the same regulations. Now the radio bridged the gap between enemies. Agariev knew exactly where Savin was. He knew the 131st Brigade had parked its T-72s in neat, parade ground rows on the station square. No infantry screen, no perimeter, just armor sitting on open pavement. Agariev begged him. "Leave," he said. "Take your boys and go. Do not let this become a bloodbath." Savin listened. He looked at his tanks. He likely understood the tactical suicide. The station was a mousetrap, wedged between 2 rings of Chechen defense. But the military machine in Moscow did not accept initiative. In the Russian army, an order is absolute. To retreat was treason. To stay was death. "I have my orders," Savin replied. "I cannot disobey." The conversation ended. Colonel Savin never made it out of the city alive. To understand Colonel Savin's fatalism, you have to rewind the tape, back to November 1994. Why did Boris Yeltsin order a storming that his own generals called suicide? Because he was trying to bury a humiliation. 1 month earlier, the Kremlin tried to do this quietly. They organized a black operation to remove Jokhar Dudayev without officially declaring war. The plan relied on a proxy force. Moscow claimed these were local opposition fighters, but the equipment told a different story. 40 T-72 tanks rolled across the border, supported by Sukhoi jets and attack helicopters. 2,000 fighters. For a covert operation, it was louder than a thunderclap. That is more heavy armor than the entire active inventory of some European nations. They expected the Chechen government to collapse at the sight of the tracks. They were wrong. The column drove into the center of Grozny. The trap snapped shut. Defenders hit the lead vehicles, then the rear. The streets became a shooting gallery. Within hours, the elite proxy force evaporated. 20 tanks turned into burning scrap metal. 150 soldiers died in the crossfire. But the death toll wasn't the crisis. The crisis was the footage. Chechen fighters pulled the surviving tank crews out of the hatches. They didn't hide them. They put them in front of television cameras. The whole world saw the faces of Russian contract soldiers. Dirty, terrified, admitting on live broadcast that they were hired by Moscow. The denial fell apart. The covert plan was dead. Humiliated and furious, Boris Yeltsin signed the decree for a total invasion. Boris Yeltsin demanded immediate revenge for the November humiliation. But the military elite knew the cost. Hundreds of officers refused the order. Special Forces commanders rejected the mission outright. They were arrested, but their warnings were ignored. To fill the gaps, the Kremlin scraped the bottom of the barrel. They assembled composite regiments from whatever units were available. This meant tank commanders met their gunners for the first time inside the moving train cars. No unit cohesion, no shared training, just strangers in steel boxes moving toward the border. The invasion launched on December 11th. The army had 2 weeks to prepare for a full-scale war. The force was a ghost of the Soviet machine. Inside the armor sat 18-year-old conscripts who had never fired a live shell, and tanks with 0 machine gun rounds. Drivers were so scarce that senior officers had to take the controls of the BMPs themselves. They steered the columns through the mud while the privates watched. The equipment was rusted. The logistics were broken. Yet the defense minister promised the president he could take Grozny with a single regiment in 2 hours. To validate the president's promise, the command assembled 2,700 men. The operational maps showed 4 armored arrows converging on the presidential palace. The reality was broken geometry. Where were the other columns? The West Group took friendly artillery fire and turned back before reaching the city limits. The East Group, elite paratroopers, simply refused the order to advance. That left only General Pulikovsky. The Northern Group, the 81st Regiment and the 131st Brigade, 50 tanks and 100 BMPs. The strategy was psychological. Roll the steel through the streets. Scare the city into submission. But a pincer movement works only with perfect communication. The Russians had none. The 2 surviving columns advanced on separate parallel streets. They were too far apart to support each other. Intelligence had promised scattered resistance from disorganized gangs. In reality, the defenders outnumbered the attackers 20-1. As the tracks ground against the asphalt, the 81st was already driving into a vacuum. Chechen hunters waited in the basements. The trap slammed shut on Prvomaiskaya Street. Chechen grenade launchers fired in a synchronized volley. One RPG strike vaporized the lead tank. Another destroyed the rear guard. The physics of the ambush were absolute. The column was instantly paralyzed. 30 armored vehicles of the 81st Regiment were locked in a stone corridor, unable to advance, unable to retreat. Then the shooting gallery opened. Commanders screamed for coordinates, but the city itself was lying to them. Chechen units had swapped the street signs days earlier. Drivers followed directions that led only deeper into the kill box. Officers stared at tourist maps bought at kiosks, trying to find landmarks that no longer existed. There was no navigation, only panic. The regiment didn't fight a battle, it dissolved. Vehicles burned where they stood. The survivors vanished into the smoke. While the 81st turned to scrap metal, the trap closed on the train station. The Abkhazian battalion emerged from the ruins. These were not farmers with rifles. They were veterans of the war in Abkhazia. They knew Soviet armor better than the 18-year-old conscripts inside it. They knew exactly where the blind spots were. Inside the T-72, the gunner spots a flash on the 5th floor. He yanks the handles back. The hydraulics whine. Then, a sickening metallic clunk. The breech hits the roof limiter. The barrel stops. The crosshairs are stuck on the 3rd floor balcony. Russian tank design prioritized low profiles for open plains. The main gun elevates only 14 degrees. In a European field, this is perfect. On a Grozny street, it is a death sentence. The enemy was on the roof. The tank could only shoot the wall. It worked the same way downwards. Depression is limited to -6 degrees. RPG teams in basement windows were untouchable. The heavy T-80s and agile BMPs became helpless iron boxes. They could drive, they could panic, but they could not fight back. The Abkhazian veterans turned the city geometry into a weapon. They stood on the roofs and fired down into the thin top armor. The probability of effective return fire was absolute zero. The trap had snapped shut. But these were T-72s and T-80s, multi-million-dollar machines designed to dominate Europe. Why couldn't they fight back? Why did the newest tanks become iron coffins? The answer was geometry. A T-72 cannot look up. Inside the turret, the air reeks of diesel and panic. The gunner spots a flash on a balcony. He yanks the controls back. He needs elevation. Clang! A dull, sickening metal impact. The cannon breech hits the roof limiter. The barrel stops moving. The main gun has a maximum elevation of 14 degrees. That is the hard limit. At a range of 50 meters, the tank cannot hit anything above the second floor. The Chechen hunter-killer teams knew the manuals better than the Russian conscripts. They set up on the 4th and 5th floors. They were untouchable. The gunners could only shoot at basements. The enemy was above. RPGs rained down into the thin top armor. Engines caught fire. Ammunition carousels detonated. Turrets spun into the air, the infamous jack-in-the-box effect. But physics wasn't the only traitor. The holes were covered in boxes called Contact 1, explosive reactive armor, designed to detonate outward and shatter a shaped charge. The crews trusted these bricks with their lives. But when the warheads hit, the boxes didn't explode. They crumpled. Logistics officers had marked the tanks as combat-ready, but inside the reactive armor blocks on the streets of Grozny, there were no explosive plates. Logistics stripped the armor, but the signals corps stripped the secrecy. The tanks were blind, and the radio waves were transparent. Static hisses in the headset. Then a voice cuts through. Not a command. Laughter. Clear, mocking laughter on the brigade's main frequency. A Chechen fighter sits in a third-floor ruin, adjusting the volume on a small black device. Blocks away, a Russian radioman in a burning BMP screams into a heavy Soviet receiver. He hears only the taunts of the man killing him. The Russian ether was a glass house. Every order, every coordinate, every cry for help. The enemy spoke fluent Russian and listened to unencrypted analog channels. They knew the tank routes before the drivers did. The defenders possessed a weapon more dangerous than an RPG. Commercial Motorola handheld radios. Secure, clear, and distributed to every squad leader. Price of one unit, $300. Price of the mechanized column it helped destroy, $10 million. Command announced a ceasefire for New Year's Eve. 15 minutes of silence before midnight. 15 minutes after. It was a psychological torture tactic. As the clock turned, the fire returned. The 131st Support Battalion tried to punch through the ring to bring ammo. They were the last hope for the casualties piling up at the station. But the airwaves had already betrayed them. The ambush was waiting. The support column burned down blocks away from the encirclement. No one else was coming. When the radio static turned into silence, the real slaughter began. Not by the enemy, by their own. On the morning of January 1st, Russian attack jets and helicopters screamed over the city. The pilots had coordinates, but they had no communication with the ground. They saw the Western group advancing. They mistook them for Chechen reinforcements. Cluster munitions shredded the column. Vehicles burned. Soldiers died under the wings of their own air support. Who killed more Russian soldiers that day? The Chechen separatists or their own air force? The answer is a statistical anomaly in modern warfare. Estimates suggest that up to 60% of all Russian casualties came from friendly fire. 60%. This is a rate of self-destruction unseen since the chaotic musketry battles of the 18th century. On the ground, the paranoia was absolute. Chechen hunter-killer teams, dressed in Russian uniforms and speaking fluent Russian, slipped through the sewer network. They surfaced between two Russian units, fired in both directions, and vanished. The result was a 6-hour firefight between two federal platoons. Neither knew they were killing their own countrymen. Reinforcements trying to break the encirclement took fire from every window. Often the fire came from terrified Russian conscripts. Both sides drove the same T-72s. Both sides carried the same AK-74s. Through the smoke and the terror, it was physically impossible to distinguish a friend from an executioner in the crosshairs. With friendly jets hunting the streets, the infantry refused to step into the open. The doctrine required them to dismount and cover the tanks. Animal fear kept them bolted inside the armor. Inside the BMPs sat crews with an average age of 19. Most had less than 10 hours of driving experience. They had zero training for a city fight. Paralyzed by the noise and the fratricide on the radio, they treated the vehicles as bunkers. They simply stopped. It was a fatal error. Chechen hunter-killer teams realized the Russians were blind. They walked right up to the stationary hulls. RPGs at point-blank range. The vehicles turned into ovens. Men who bailed out were shredded by snipers on the rooftops. Men who stayed inside never came out. Brigade Commander Savin tried to organize a defense from the center of the kill zone. Despite a severe wound, he stayed on the net, calling for reinforcements. Savin continued to issue orders to a brigade that was rapidly ceasing to exist. While the infantry hid inside their steel boxes, the trap around the 131st Brigade snapped shut. By January 1st, the Maikop Brigade had been cut off at the train station for 24 hours. The geography of the city had turned against them. Every window facing the station was a firing position. The casualty count was already terminal, between 300 and 350 killed. The station basement became a waiting room for death. The air down there was heavy and unbreathable, a suffocating mix of burning rubber, diesel fumes, and the copper smell of blood. At sundown, Colonel Savin made a desperate move to save the critical cases. He loaded 40 wounded men onto the last 3 operational BMPs. They roared out of the gate, but the city was a maze. The drivers panicked and turned toward the city center instead of the perimeter. When they tried to correct the mistake, the Chechen RPG teams were waiting. 3 vehicles left, 0 returned. Only 13 men survived the ambush to be taken prisoner. Command at Konkala offered hallucinations instead of support. They radioed Savin to take civilian hostages for leverage. The Chechens didn't care. Then headquarters suggested sneaking out at night, as if the brigade hadn't thought of that. By January 2nd, the battle moved inside the walls. RPG warheads shattered the brickwork. Hand grenades bounced down the stairwells. The Russians were down to their last magazines. Savin understood the math. Staying meant execution. Leaving meant a slim chance. This choice would cost him his life in less than 3 hours. He didn't wait for permission from Moscow. The colonel ordered the survivors to abandon the heavy metal and break out on foot. They had a chance to leave quietly, but at the 70th meter, the nerves gave out. January 2nd, night. Colonel Savin led the column along the railroad ties. No heavy armor, no radio chatter, just boots on gravel. The Chechens did not shoot. 70 meters of dead air. It felt like a miracle. But the men were broken, shell-shocked, hallucinating from fatigue. Discipline evaporated with every step. Then 3 shapes loomed in the dark. Lost BMPs from the Samara Regiment. Savin made the call. He loaded the critically wounded into the metal shells. He climbed onto the lead machine himself. The engine roared. Then, a flash. An RPG warhead slammed into the hull. Sparks sprayed the armor like a grinder hitting steel. The machine stopped dead. Savin crawled onto the cold asphalt. He died right there, beside the burning wreck. The second BMP took a hit seconds later. Moscow ignored the sacrifice. Officials signed the decree for his Hero of Russia title only in 2005, 10 years too late. The survivors ran into the dark and vanished. Colonel Savin's death was a tragedy, but on paper it became just one line of data. a statistic that terrified the general staff in Moscow. By the morning of January 3rd, the 131st Brigade ceased to exist as a fighting force. The breakdown looked like a typo. 789 killed, 75 captured, only 60 men reached friendly lines. The entire 1st Battalion was simply erased from the roster. Camera crews filmed the aftermath. First, a single burning BMP, then a row of twisted hulls, finally, a horizon of scrap metal. 102 armored vehicles, 20 of 26 tanks destroyed, all Tunguska anti-aircraft systems burned. Analysts crunched the ratios. The percentage of armor lost in Grozny was higher than in the Battle of Berlin in 1945. The Soviet army lost less steel storming the Reichstag than the Russian army did fighting its own citizens. The dead were the lucky ones. For the families, the nightmare was just starting. Bulletin boards covered in paper, endless lists of names. 1,996 soldiers remain listed as missing in action. They vanished into the ruins. The truth only surfaced years later. In 2008, construction workers in Grozny hit something hard in the earth. It was a mass grave containing 800 bodies. 800 rotting bodies in a single pit forced the Kremlin to rewrite the rules of engagement forever. The disaster of the New Year's assault killed the concept of the rapid tank rush. Russian generals realized that precise maneuvers were impossible, so they chose erasure. The strategy shifted instantly. The tanks stopped driving. The artillery opened fire. 30,000 shells per day. That is the density required to turn reinforced concrete into gray powder. It was the heaviest bombardment in Europe since the Second World War. The city was not being captured. It was being deleted. Thousands of civilians died under the barrage, most of them ethnic Russians with nowhere to run. But Moscow stopped counting collateral damage. The Chechens managed to retake the ruins in 1996, but the reprieve was short. In 1999, Vladimir Putin returned to the Caucasus with the lessons of the First War burned into the military doctrine. He did not send unsupported columns into the trap. He leveled the grid squares one by one. The resistance was broken by the sheer tonnage of high explosives. Moscow declared victory and installed a controlled government to rule over the ashes.